At this point, everything becomes very simple, but not easy. Because once you understand capital, risk, and leverage, the only thing left between you and real financial growth is execution. And execution is where most people fail, not because they lack knowledge, but because they refuse to act consistently over time. The truth is, there is no secret after 20,000. There is no hidden shortcut, no sudden breakthrough that magically changes your life overnight. What changes is your position in the system. You are no longer at zero. You are no longer forced to make desperate decisions. You now have the ability to play a different game, but whether you win or not depends entirely on how you operate from this point forward. And this is where the final shift happens. You stop asking how to make money, and you start asking how to build a system that makes money. Because making money is an action. A system is a structure. Actions require constant input. Systems produce output over time. And the people who build wealth are not the ones who work the hardest, but the ones who build systems that continue working even when they are not. This is the transition from effort to architecture. From movement to direction. From chaos to design. And once you understand this, your priorities change completely. You begin to focus less on earning more and more on keeping, allocating, and compounding what you already have. Because compounding is the only force that can turn small numbers into large ones. But compounding requires three things: time, consistency, and protection from catastrophic loss. Remove any one of these, and the entire process collapses. This is why people who get close to success often fall back. Not because they didn't have the opportunity, but because they violated one of these principles. They rushed. They took unnecessary risks. They broke consistency. And the system reset them back to zero. So the real question is not how to grow fast. The real question is how to stay in the game long enough for growth to become inevitable. And the answer to that is discipline at a level most people are not willing to maintain. Because discipline is not about motivation. It is about standards. It is about doing what is required regardless of how you feel, regardless of external noise, regardless of short-term outcomes. And this is where your environment becomes critical. If you are surrounded by people who consume, you will consume. If you are surrounded by people who build, you will build. Because behavior is contagious. Standards are contagious. And most people underestimate how much their surroundings shape their financial reality. So if you want to operate at a higher level, you need to consciously design your environment to support that. The information you consume, the people you interact with, the habits you repeat, all of it either reinforces growth or undermines it. There is no neutral state. You are either moving forward or drifting backward. And the same applies to your money. Capital that is not allocated intelligently will decay. Not always visibly, but inevitably. Through inflation, through missed opportunities, through inefficiency. And this is why the final stage is about alignment. Aligning your behavior with your goals. Aligning your decisions with reality. Aligning your time, your energy, and your capital into a single direction. Because once everything is aligned, progress becomes unavoidable. Not fast, not explosive, but consistent. And consistency, over time, becomes dominance. This is the part that nobody talks about. Wealth is not built in moments of intensity. It is built in long periods of controlled, deliberate execution. Quiet, repetitive actions that compound beneath the surface. And eventually, after enough time, the results appear suddenly. But they are not sudden. They are the visible outcome of invisible consistency. And this is why everything changes after 20,000. Not because the number itself is large, but because it marks the point where the rules become clear. Where you move from confusion to understanding. From reaction to intention. From effort to structure. And once you see the system for what it is, you cannot unsee it. You realize that the path forward is not about working harder, but about operating smarter. Not about chasing money, but about positioning yourself so that money flows toward you. Not about luck, but about alignment with principles that do not change. And at that point, the game is no longer about escaping. It is about building. Building systems, building assets, building a life where your time is no longer traded, but owned. Because in the end, that is the real definition of wealth. Not how much you have, but how much control you have over your time, your decisions, and your future. And once you reach that understanding, you are no longer the same person who was struggling to reach that first 20,000. You are operating at a completely different level. And from that level, everything else becomes a matter of scale. After you understand that protecting your capital is more important than chasing fast growth, you enter the next level, understanding how that capital can actually start working for you. Because having $20,000 by itself changes nothing if you continue to behave as if you don't have it. And this is where the concept that separates people permanently comes into play: leverage. Most people have heard this word, but very few truly understand what it means in practice. They think it is just about borrowing money or using financial instruments. But real leverage is much broader. It is the ability to multiply outcomes without proportionally increasing effort. It is the point where you move beyond the linear equation of time equals money and begin to build a system where the output exceeds the input. And it is only after you accumulate some capital that you can realistically begin to do this. Before that, you simply do not have the margin to experiment. Every mistake is too expensive. Every attempt carries too much risk. But once you have a base, even a small one, you gain something critical: the ability to test, to learn, to try, and most importantly, to fail without collapsing. And that accelerates your progress dramatically, because knowledge gained through real action is always more valuable than theory. This is where most people make another critical mistake. They remain stuck in a preservation mindset instead of transitioning into a scaling mindset. They keep thinking about how not to lose, but never fully shift into how to multiply. And without that shift, growth stalls. Because wealth is not built by saving alone. Saving creates stability, but growth requires allocation. It requires directing capital into opportunities that can produce more than you could ever generate through your own time. And this is where different forms of leverage begin to emerge. The first is skill leverage. If you invest in skills that increase the value of your time, you are already creating asymmetry. The second is technological leverage. The internet, automation, digital products, these allow you to scale output without constant effort. The third is human leverage. When you begin to coordinate the efforts of others, you expand your capacity beyond your individual limits. And the fourth is capital leverage itself: investments, businesses, and assets that generate returns independently of your direct involvement. But there is a critical truth that most people overlook: leverage does not create a foundation, it amplifies whatever already exists. If your system is weak, leverage will expose it. If your discipline is inconsistent, leverage will magnify your mistakes. This is why moving into leverage requires a different level of thinking. You are no longer just working, you are designing. You are building a structure where each element has a role. Your money is not idle, it is deployed. Your time is not scattered. It is allocated. Your actions are not random, they are intentional. And this is where the real shift happens. Because now your growth is no longer tied directly to your effort. It becomes tied to the quality of your decisions. And that is a much more complex game. Because effort alone is no longer enough. You need clarity, direction, and an understanding of how your actions connect to scalable outcomes. This is where the gap between people starts to widen rapidly. Those who understand leverage begin to accelerate. Those who do not remain in the same loop, just with slightly more money. But there is a paradox here. The moment you gain access to leverage is also the moment you become vulnerable to misusing it. Because leverage amplifies everything. It amplifies good decisions, but it also amplifies errors. And if you apply leverage without understanding, you do not just lose, you lose faster. That is why the transition from 20,000 to real wealth is not about aggression, it is about control. Control over your decisions, your behavior, and most importantly, your impulses. Because at this level, the biggest risk is no longer external. It is internal. It is the desire to speed things up, to prove something, to shortcut the process. And every time you act on that impulse, you move backwards, even if it feels like progress. This is where patience becomes a competitive advantage. Where inaction is often the correct decision. Where waiting for the right opportunity is more valuable than chasing 10 average ones. And this is extremely difficult, because it contradicts everything you were taught. You were told that more action leads to more results. But in capital allocation, more action often leads to more mistakes. The goal is not to be active, it is to be precise. And precision requires clarity, restraint, and the ability to operate without emotional pressure. Because once you reach this level, you begin to realize something important. $20,000 does not just change your financial position, it reveals your financial identity. It shows you who you are when you finally have something to lose. And that is where the real game begins. Once you reach that first 20,000, most people think the hard part is over. In reality, this is where the real game begins, because now you are faced with a completely different problem, not how to earn money, but how to not lose it. And this is where the majority of people fail again, just at a higher level. Because the system that kept you broke in the first place does not disappear when you accumulate capital, it adapts. It becomes more subtle, more sophisticated, and more dangerous. Before, your money was drained through obvious expenses, rent, food, bills. Now, it is drained through decisions that feel intelligent, justified, and even deserved. This is where lifestyle inflation quietly re-enters your life. But in a more deceptive form. You tell yourself that you worked hard, that you earned this, that upgrading your environment, your clothes, your experiences is a natural progression. And while some level of improvement is reasonable, most people do not realize that they are recreating the same trap at a higher level. The gap they fought so hard to build between income and expenses starts to close again. Slowly at first, then all at once. And just like that, they are back in a position where nothing accumulates, except now the numbers are bigger and the illusion is stronger. But the real danger is not spending. The real danger is misunderstanding risk. When you first accumulate capital, you feel a surge of confidence. You feel like you finally figured it out. And this is where people make their most expensive mistakes. They overestimate their knowledge, underestimate uncertainty, and start making decisions based on emotion rather than principle. They chase quick returns, jump into trends, invest in things they do not fully understand, and confuse luck with skill. Because when you go from zero to something, it feels like progress is accelerating. But without a system, that progress is fragile. And fragility in finance is invisible until it breaks. This is why the concept of risk becomes critical at this stage. Risk is not just about losing money. It is about losing position. It is about falling back into a state where you have to start over. And starting over is far more expensive than moving forward slowly. The people who actually build wealth understand this deeply. They are not obsessed with making money quickly. They are obsessed with not going backwards. They protect their capital first, and only then do they think about growing it. Because they understand that survival is the prerequisite for success. If you cannot stay in the game, you cannot win. And this is where discipline evolves into strategy. At the beginning, discipline is about saying no to unnecessary spending. At this stage, discipline becomes about saying no to unnecessary risk. Not every opportunity is worth taking. Not every trend is worth following. Not every investment is worth your capital. And the ability to filter, to wait, to remain inactive when there is no clear edge, this is what separates those who keep their 20,000 from those who lose it. Another shift that happens at this level is your relationship with time. Before, time was your primary resource. You traded it directly for money. But once you have capital, time and money begin to interact differently. You start to see opportunities where money can replace time. You can invest in tools, in knowledge, in systems that make you more efficient. You can start to think in terms of leverage. And leverage is the force that changes everything. Because leverage allows you to scale your output without scaling your effort linearly. This can come in many forms: financial leverage, skill leverage, network leverage, technological leverage. But the key idea is the same. You are no longer limited strictly by your physical hours. And this is where the gap between people begins to widen rapidly. Those who understand leverage start to move faster, with less effort, and more precision. Those who do not remain stuck in the same equation, just with slightly more money. But here is the paradox: the moment you gain access to leverage is also the moment you become vulnerable to misusing it. Because leverage amplifies everything. It amplifies good decisions. But it also amplifies mistakes. And if you apply leverage without understanding, you do not just lose, you lose faster. This is why the transition from 20,000 to real wealth is not about aggression, it is about control. Control over your behavior, control over your decisions, and most importantly, control over your impulses. Because at this level, the biggest threat is no longer external. It is internal. It is your desire to accelerate, to prove something, to shortcut the process. And every time you give in to that impulse, you move backwards, even if it feels like you are moving forward. This is the stage where patience becomes a competitive advantage. Where doing nothing is often the correct decision. Where waiting for the right opportunity is more valuable than chasing 10 average ones. And this is extremely difficult because it goes against everything you were conditioned to believe. You were taught that more action equals more results. But in capital allocation, more action often equals more mistakes. The goal is not to be active, the goal is to be effective. And effectiveness requires clarity, restraint, and the ability to operate without emotional pressure. Because once you understand this, you realize something important. $20,000 does not just change your financial position, it exposes your financial character. It shows you who you are when you have something to lose. And that is the real test. There is a number that most people completely misunderstand, and because they misunderstand it, they never reach it. It is not $1 million, it is not financial freedom, and it is not some abstract idea of getting rich. It is far smaller, far more realistic, and yet far more powerful than people are willing to admit. That number is $20,000. At first glance, it feels insignificant. In a world where social media constantly pushes extreme wealth, luxury lifestyles, and overnight success stories, $20,000 looks almost trivial. But that perception is exactly what keeps people trapped, because they are aiming at outcomes they do not understand, while completely ignoring the first real inflection point that actually changes everything. Because the truth is, nothing changes when you want to be rich. Nothing changes when you plan to be rich. Everything changes when you prove, through action, that you can accumulate capital. And the first real proof of that ability, for most people, happens around this level. Before you reach this point, your entire financial life is structured around survival and reaction. You are living in a system where your income is immediately consumed by your expenses, your decisions are short-term, and your margin for error is almost zero. One unexpected bill, one mistake, one bad month, and everything collapses. In that state, you are not managing money, you are responding to it. You are not making strategic decisions. You are making urgent ones. And urgency is the enemy of wealth. Because when you are forced to act under pressure, you do not optimize for long-term growth, you optimize for immediate relief. This is why most people stay stuck for years, not because they lack intelligence or effort, but because they are operating in an environment where long-term thinking is structurally impossible. But once you cross that threshold, even slightly, something fundamental begins to shift. You are no longer completely dependent on your next paycheck. You have created a small buffer between yourself and chaos. And that buffer, even if it seems small, changes your behavior in ways that compound over time. Because now, for the first time, you are not just earning money, you are holding it. And holding money is the beginning of power. Most people underestimate this because they think power comes from large amounts, but power actually begins with control. If you cannot control a small amount, you will not be able to control a large one. $20,000 is not important because of its size, it is important because of what it represents: discipline, delayed gratification, and the ability to operate outside of pure consumption. To reach this point, you had to do something most people never do. You had to break the automatic link between earning and spending. You had to consciously decide that not every increase in income justifies an increase in lifestyle. And this is where the real battle happens. Because the system around you is designed to prevent exactly this behavior. Every advertisement, every social signal, every cultural expectation is pushing you to spend, upgrade, and display. You are rewarded socially for consumption, not for accumulation. So choosing to accumulate, even a small amount, is not just a financial decision, it is a psychological rebellion against the environment you are in. And once you succeed in doing that, even at a small scale, your identity begins to shift. You stop seeing yourself as someone who simply works and spends, and you begin to see yourself as someone who builds and allocates. This shift is subtle, but it is everything. Because from that point forward, you no longer evaluate money based on what it can buy, but on what it can become. You begin to think in terms of future value instead of present satisfaction. And this changes the way you see every decision. A purchase is no longer just a purchase, it is a trade-off between immediate pleasure and future growth. An investment is no longer risky by default, It becomes a calculated move within a system you are starting to understand. And most importantly, time itself begins to look different. Before, time was something you sold. Now, time becomes something you can buy back. Because capital, even in small amounts, gives you optionality. It gives you the ability to say no, to wait, to choose better opportunities instead of accepting the first one available. And this is where the nonlinear effect begins. Because once you have capital, even a small amount, you can start to use it. You can invest, you can experiment, you can learn through action rather than theory. And this is where most people fall behind permanently. They stay in a state where all of their learning is abstract, because they never have capital to deploy. But when you do, even mistakes become valuable, because they are real. You are no longer just thinking about money, you are interacting with it. And that interaction accelerates your understanding in a way that no book or course ever could. This is why the first $20,000 is so important. It is not the end goal, it is the transition point. It is where you move from being a participant in the system to someone who can start to influence their position within it. It is where you stop being purely reactive and begin to act with intention. And once that shift happens, everything else becomes a function of scale. The principles do not change, only the numbers do. But if you never reach this point, you never even enter the game. You remain stuck in a loop where effort does not translate into progress, where time is continuously exchanged but nothing accumulates. And this is why so many people feel like they are working hard but going nowhere. Because without accumulation, there is no leverage. And without leverage, there is no escape. $20,000 is not wealth. But it is the first signal that wealth is now mathematically possible in your life.